Hey everyone, my name is David Rao and I'm the music teacher who blogs at makemomentsmatter.org. You can also find my ideas on Instagram, on Pinterest, Twitter, a variety of other places when you search for my name, David Rao, or Make Moments Matter. So today I'm going to be talking about how to interview for a music teacher position, how to field questions that are aimed towards you, some ideas, some thoughts about that process, and then I hope that maybe y'all will give some questions, comments, feedback too, so that we can sort of make this more of a conversation and less of me like, here's what I've done, because I know we all interview differently, and so I know that as we're thinking through this process, it'd be really helpful for everyone to sort of get more ideas from one another. That's coming up in just a second. First, let me just say, if you are curious about any of the resources, things that I mention in this video, I always have a page dedicated on my blog for all the stuff that I talk about in these videos. You can either find it within the caption for this video podcast, however you're accessing this content, or you can go to my blog, makemomentsmatter.org, and click on the video tab. There should be a drop down. You could find Musical Mondays Recap for this school year. Also, there is a Facebook group called Every Moment Matters Music Education Community. Come join us. It's a great place to continue conversations and ask questions and make friends. Okay, so Facebook and Instagram have been really causing me trouble since holiday break, winter break. So who knows? Last week, Facebook just cut out for literally no reason. A couple weeks before that, Instagram just wouldn't post. I don't know. Things are being weird. So I hope that you can hear, watch, see, access this content. Here's hoping that continues on. But who knows? If it stops, I'll try and reconnect. So anyway, why am I talking about interviewing? Well, one of the reasons is I just finished with a student teacher at my school for a student teaching placement, and we were talking about all of this. Also, I know that it's about to be like interview season. So if you are looking for a gig, if you are curious about finding a new job, if you're a brand new teacher or student teaching, now's the time when a lot of times people will put in if they're going to retire. They'll put in that information now and jobs will open up. And then really it's a domino effect after that. Like once those retiree jobs are filled, or if there's a new building or something where those people who know that they're going to be hiring for next year, once that gets filled, then other vacancies start opening because people leave jobs to take jobs. And sometimes people just decide to leave jobs, or they move away, or, all sorts of things. But now's the time when that job interview process really starts up. So last week I talked about what you might do before an interview to get that interview, sort of talking about like a digital portfolio, talking about ways you can prepare yourself, or ways you can market yourself, or way you can find jobs. And so last week I talked about my digital portfolio. I linked that on the links page if you want to see it, just so you can sort of see like what that might look like if you wanted to do one yourself. I also talked about how you can make friends at local ORF chapters, local music education meetings, so that you can find out where those jobs are going to be, because the best way to know if a job is going to open up is to know the people who know that. And so especially if you're moving into a new area, it's great to have like a friend in the area or make a connection to help you sort of figure out, is there a job opening or not? And before I jump into these like interview questions, if you're like, I am happy in my job and I don't think I'm ever going to leave, then this is a great time to add in your comments of, I'm watching and I agree with this, or I would do it differently, or et cetera, et cetera. That's great. But also, as someone who loved my job, was so happy in my first job, and then family moved and things happened, and I moved across the country, you never know. So it's always good to have these ideas in your head of like, hey, what would an interview be like? Or what are questions people might ask? Or maybe you're going to be on the interview team to fill a job in another building. Then it's great to listen and to sort of have ideas about what sort of questions might be asked, what you could think about asking, why you'd ask that. And so that's sort of, for everyone, this could be a great conversation. But if you are someone who has interviewed a lot, or you're curious about that, or have thoughts, please drop those into the comments as we go, so that this can be more of a conversation, and I can get all of your thoughts as well. Okay, so the first thing is the interview process. Usually at a bigger district, there are usually 2 or 3 interviews to get a job, to win a job. The first one is usually just like a placement, like a general district screening, basically. And that happens all the time. And it is very frustrating, but you have to do it a lot of times with these bigger school districts. Usually that's before you ever hear a principal. It might be with just some HR coordinator. It might be over the phone. I'm not, like, who knows? Every district is different. But usually there's some sort of screening interview that just, are you qualified? Yes, no, So it's pretty basic, usually that first one. Usually the more in-depth, intricate questions are when you get to an interview with a building principal or a building administrator, or sort of closer to the job that you actually want to get. If it's just like a screening interview for the whole district, it might be at district office. They may not even have a job opening, but they're just screening you to meet you, to know that you have interest, to make sure that you fit qualifications, that sort of thing. Then usually there's like a building interview where you actually meet people in the building. Sometimes it's just the principal, sometimes it's the principal and a team of people that they want on the interview team to make sure that, they know that they're hiring somebody great. It is different in every district and in every building in every district. Not everybody handles it the same way. And then a lot of times if you get past that, there may be another interview, there may be something else, who knows? They maybe have narrowed their candidate list and they want to interview their top 3. Who knows? Everybody does it different. A lot of times there is one final interview with an HR person where they offer you the job or answer final questions or, go through those final things and then talk about benefits, talk about compensation, all those sorts of things. It has always baffled me that we, as educators, very rarely talk about compensation, money, all those sorts of things until the end, until you're basically hired, which is so frustrating, but is sort of a process that is, can be typical for education. It really depends on you and the place you're interviewing. But usually there are multiple interviews to actually win a job. It is very rare, and I have interviewed for a lot of positions, again, because over time I had to move to Michigan, and then I had to move to Georgia, and then we moved back to Kansas. So I just because of life, not because I'm unhappy in my job, but just because of life or moving new places, I've interviewed in different situations and I've seen a lot. So it is very rare that you have the first interview with the building principal. That's rare, but not unheard of. I've had that happen before. So I'd love to talk through some sample questions and give some ideas about how you might answer or what you might say if you are going to be interviewing for that position. And I'll just say now, there is no right answer for a question. Really, it's like when we're talking with students, and trying to get them to think deeply. When people ask these interview questions, they're listening for a lot of things in your answer. They're listening to learn more about you. They're listening to try and understand your thought process. They're trying to see if you're a team player. They're trying to understand your priorities. So while you may answer a question about one thing, you may answer their question about something else. As you answer that question about curriculum, you might also answer their question about, is this person going to work well in my building with the rest of the team? So it's always good to think through your answers. Like I said, there is no one right answer, but it is always okay to take time and say, that's a great question. Or let me think just a second about that. It's always okay to take a few seconds to get your thoughts in order before you barrel into an answer. In fact, barreling into an answer is never a good thing. It is always good to stop, think through, and process through what you want to say before you say it. That's okay. You are not expected to have an answer like that. Unless the question's what's your name, where are you from? Hopefully you know that. But generally, if it's a question about something, you have time to think about it. But there is no one right way to answer. And sometimes you also have to think about who is asking and why are they asking. And just know that sometimes you may give a stellar all-star home run answer and the person may not like it because they have some weird expectation about the answer and why you should answer a certain way. So just know interviews are weird. I remember one time I had someone say, so with students, would you rather empower them or enable them? And I was like, what? Do you want to empower students or do you want to enable students? And like in my head, I'm like, I know that one of those words means more to this interviewer than the other, that like there's loaded language here, but I don't know which one you like and I don't know why. I think I said I wanted to enable students, and he was like, really? Enable them? You don't want to empower them? And I was like, oh, I chose wrong, but let me defend my answer. And I was like, well, yeah, music making, it's not just talent. It's not just some innate ability the way a lot of people might think. Really, music making is a process, and so much of it is communal. And so I know that some students, when they get to those harder levels of music making, more than just singing, when it's they're creating or they're improvising or they're coming up with things, sometimes they shut down because they don't feel like that they're not a music maker. Someone told them at some point in their life that they're not good at making music. And I don't feel like that's fair. I want them to feel like they have all the abilities and skills and the processes, and they're smart and are able to join in the music making process. And enabling is really giving them the skills and the mindset that they need to join in that music making process. It's more than just giving them the power to do it. It's giving them the skills and knowing how to do it and I was like, dang, this is a good answer. Maybe. But still, this person had this idea in their head of what the right answer was already. So like, all that to say, just you give the best answer you can in the moment, and that is probably the right answer, because you can think about it forever afterwards and be frustrated about it. But just, plan, go into it, and then just give the answer that you think is the best in the moment. So I'm going to give some sample questions and talk through how you might answer some of them. But the really great thing to do if you're going to be planning and interviewing is like reach out to a friend who's a principal, reach out to a friend in another building, reach out to someone who's been on an interview committee and say, hey, what are the questions you asked? Or what questions do you think they might ask? Or, whatever. Or if you're student teaching, go to your building, the principal at the building you're at, and say, hey, could I do a mock interview with you? Or what kind of questions would you ask if you were going to interview me? I know the person I'm student teaching with is not going to leave their job, but what if they did? What would you ask? And it's okay to go and ask those people, what would you ask, so that you have a baseline and sort of understanding what you might be walking into. Okay, so let's talk about some sample questions. There are some questions that you can expect to get asked. You can expect to get asked, tell us a little bit about yourself. This is always the first question. Why? Because it sets up the interview. It lets them know a little bit about you. You can share as much or as little as you want. You can share personal things. You can share your growing up history. But I would say keep it brief. Less than 30 seconds, 45 seconds, because really this is not the meat of the interview. This is just the icebreaker. So give them a little bit and then elaborate later. For me, when people ask me that, I say, well, I grew up in a really small town in Nebraska. By small, I mean it was less than 300 people. I graduated in a class of 14 at a public school, so very, very small school. But I went on to go to college in Illinois, and then I went to graduate school in Kansas City. That's where I got my first job after I did student teaching and my education degree. And I loved it. I sort of go into some of that, but that gives them like a little bit of understanding about how like I had a very different experience, or here's the experience. It gives them connections. And a lot of times saying like, well, I grew up in a small town on a farm in Nebraska. People have ideas about what that is, but also like my current principal, I remember like she in that interview was like, I grew up in Iowa. Like we connected on that. So share as much or as little as you want. It's totally up to you. There is no must say answer, but just share a little bit about yourself. They might also say, what are your qualifications for this position? You could talk about your training or the things that you've done to help prepare for the position if you want. I really like when they start getting into the like meaty questions, like questions that actually like deal with curriculum or actual situations. And one of the things that I do when I prepare for an interview is I go through what I think might be sample questions, and I like give myself like a sentence stem, like a question answer starter of like, if they ask a question about classroom management, how would I answer that? What's an example from my classroom that I could pull out? If they ask me about special learners, What's a way that I may answer that? What's an example I might pull out? Because people love to be drawn into stories. So you telling them a story about something you experienced in a concrete way that you can give them a view into your classroom, a concrete answer. This happened to me. Here's how I responded. Maybe it wasn't the best. Afterwards, this is what I think I do differently, or here's how it helped the student, or blah, blah, blah. But give them an example if possible. So I go through all the big things. They're going to probably ask about classroom management. They might ask, like, what's a sample day in your room? Like, what does a sample lesson look like? They'll probably ask you, like, how do you include special learners? And they might be specific. They might say, like, students with an IEP. They might say someone with a physical disability. They might say a class with needs differentiation. They might be specific about that. They might not. So have some ideas in your head. They're probably going to also ask how you work with teammates, how you integrate with the school, like what do you do to help the school community or integrate with the school community. Those are all great things to sort of think about before you get into that interview. So let's talk about a couple of those and like how you might answer. Okay, so I'm looking at, I have a set of questions that like they asked my replacement when I left my job in Georgia, and I was on that interview team to help pick my replacement. And so some of the questions they asked, the principal was like, I would love for you to be on that because I don't know a lot about music. And that's another thing. The person interviewing you may know nothing about music education, and that could be good or bad. But you need to think that, you need to assume they don't know a lot. And so in your interview, you need to explain some things. You can't just say like, oh yeah, well, Takadimi. They maybe don't know what that is. A lot of people don't know what that means. It's a rhythm syllable counting system. Or like, why would you use that? You need to have a quick answer for that. Or if you say like Orff Schulwerk or Kodai, they maybe don't know what that is. And so you could explain, oh yeah, it's just an approach for teaching music education. It's basically, and even though it's not really a methodology, you could say like, oh, it's a methodology to let them, because that's like a buzzword they understand. As opposed to saying like, well, let me go into a 2-minute spiel about, blah, blah, blah. You can give them some sort of quick shorthand things. But just know if they're going to ask a content question, they maybe don't know the content answer. So you need to explain a little bit along the way. So like, here's an example. If an outside observer were to walk into your classroom, what would they see? And I love answering this one. I like to say, well, it really depends on the day. It depends on the grade level. It depends on the content that we're teaching, because in an elementary music classroom, we sing, we play instruments, we dance, we use expressive movement, we improvise, we read, we recite poetry, we create together. And sometimes that looks messy, especially to someone who's not been there for the whole process. Sometimes when you walk in to a music classroom, it feels a little chaotic because maybe we're exploring on the instruments, or maybe we're creating together, or maybe we're in a small group. Maybe I've asked them to improvise a small 8-beat creation that they're going to play on instruments together. But if you walk in the middle of the process, you don't see the end. And so sometimes that stuff in the middle, it looks a little messy and feels a little messy. But I want students in any classroom any class to have a chance to imitate, a chance to sing, a chance to play, to create. But I also want in every lesson a chance for them to create and explore and try something new. And so if you walk into a typical classroom, you might see that part. And if you only see those 2 minutes, it might seem a little crazy. But it all comes together in the end, because we bring, you can walk them through some of that. But I love them to know that there is a creative process, and along the way, in the classroom, it might feel or seem a little bit chaotic or messy to an outside observer because we're creating, and that's okay. That's our goal. I want them to do that. So, it's fun. And then you can give an example. Okay, well, here's an example of a song we did just, 2 weeks ago, that if you walked into the wrong moment, it might seem crazy. So what happened was we learned first a part all together. That was sort of the chorus, you might say, and it was or the refrain. It's the part that we all knew that we could play together. And then we broke apart little pieces, and each small group got to come up with an 8-beat improvisation that they got to play on the instrument with certain pitches. They could play whatever they wanted, but then, we would play the whole group, the whole class would play together at the end of class, and then one group would play their creation. And then all of us would play our main part together, and then another group would play. And then, and it went back and forth. That's called a rondo. And the rondo form is great because everybody gets included every few seconds, everyone plays, but then small groups get to do their little call out. And so if you walk in the middle of class when they're just creating, well, that does seem crazy. But if you see it at the end, it's great because you get to see such amazing structure and moments for improvisation, moments for creation. But talking them through, giving them an example like that is really meaningful for anybody interviewing. Okay, here's another example. How do you plan to adjust instruction for special learners? Could you give us an example of how you've adapted instruction for special learners in the past? That's a great starter because it allows you to decide what kind of special learner we're talking about and also what sort of example you want to give. For me, I remember when I interviewed and had this sort of question, it was easy. It popped up. I knew exactly who I was going to talk about because first of all, I had thought a little ahead of time, but also I had this student in my class and it was a great moment talking about how we would adapt. And, you might give an example and say well, I want all students to be a part of music making, but for different students that looks different, differentiation based on their needs and on what works for them. And especially when it comes to special learners or special situations, I really lean into the classroom teachers, special ed teachers, and the IEP, and I really want to look at that to make sure that what we're doing matches what the student needs. That can be a little tricky when I have to manage 500 students, 800 students, however many students you would have. So I always lean into that some people call them caseworker or their special ed teacher or whatever, because I want to ask them what has worked in the general ed classroom or what has worked in other classrooms, because I want to sort of start with that and run with that and then make adaptations as needed. So an example, a student, let's call him, Danny. So Danny was in my room. Danny is diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, and all students on the spectrum react in different ways. They have different things that affect them, and the way that they learn has to be adapted based on those needs and on what really works for them or doesn't work for them. And so a lot of the times for Danny, the way that this would work was he would work really well with a partner. And so I had no problem partnering him off for all different sorts of activities. Sometimes he needed different instruments because for Danny, sometimes the auditory, the sounds or textures would really affect him. So some of our instruments have textures, or the way you hold them creates a vibration in your hand. And for him, he did not like that. Or egg shakers were really a trigger for him. Something about the way it felt in his hand and the sound that it made, he really did not like that. So I knew for Danny's class, I needed to use activities that didn't really use egg shakers, or I needed to have an alternative in place. And just, giving an example like that, I know my students, I know that that answer sort of says I collaborate with the special ed teachers. I know what an IEP is, and I know how to look for it. I know how to listen to it and care about it. And also I know how to adapt for a specific learner. You could talk about if there are students with physical disabilities or who need adaptations for movement. You could talk about any sort of experience you've had where you need to make a change based on what the kid needs. But have a couple examples ready to go so that you can, no matter what they ask, that you can sort of have that answer ready to go. Okay, another question they might ask, what are ways that you assess your own teaching and effectiveness? Fun question. Okay, well, music teachers, we assess all the time. And one of the, the big things that people assess us by, whether it's fair or not, are concerts and things that we do as far as public performance. And so, I always try and think about in those moments, listening to feedback, listening to others, but also knowing that I'm teaching the audience as much as I'm teaching the students. And so their expectations of what they might hear might be different, but really that feels like a ginormous assessment. And so I always try and make those moments, really exciting for kids and fun for kids, but also a learning experience. But honestly, in my classroom, when I'm thinking about my own personal growth and how students are learning, I like to do a couple things. I like to try different things with different homerooms. If something isn't working, I'll change it for, Miss Johnson's class versus Miss Sudak's class or whatever, to see if one technique works better than another. Maybe I phrase things a little bit differently so that I can see if that has a different effect on students. Sometimes I'll videotape myself to go back and watch and see, like, what have I been, as you're teaching, sometimes you forget, like, oh, well, I say that a lot, or, I need to get away from the piano or whatever. You don't realize that until you sit and actually see it. But for me, self-assessment comes in, at the end of the lesson, how well do kids seem to know it? And if I do that thing where I try different techniques with different classes, I might find that one is more effective than another. And so that helps me assess whether, my practice needs to be changed. If I videotape myself, I can sort of see, I can go back and see things when I'm not, in that adrenaline moment while I'm teaching to get more feedback for myself. But, and so in that answer, you're giving a couple different ways that you might assess, but it just shows the interviewer that you're thoughtful and that you do value assessment of yourself and how you might change your practice based on that. Okay, I love questions like this one. What was the worst lesson you've ever taught? Something that flopped? How did you handle it, and what did you learn from it? I have an example from when I was teaching recorder. I have an example from when I've taught centers, and I didn't explain the process very well. I have an example of a song that I thought was just going to be super bomb amazing, and kids were going to love it, and they did not like it at all. And I also have an example of when I tried to teach a song, but I overloaded. I asked them to do too much too quick. All of those answers are answers that I could pull out. The recorder one talks about a new process I was not quite prepared for, or thinking about too many processes at once. Another one might be where you talk about the scaffolding of how you're going to scaffold better in the future, or you've learned something about scaffolding because of that, or, thinking about, there's so many ways that you can answer that, but even though it's a question like, what was the worst lesson you ever taught? You can frame that as, here's this terrible lesson, here's how bad it went, and here's what I learned from it. Because you don't want it just to be, oh, here's a terrible lesson. Wow, it stunk. I never taught that one again. It should always be like, here's a lesson. It didn't go the way I planned, or the way I assumed. And here's what I learned, and here's how I taught it differently the next time. But just showing improvement. But have like a couple ideas of like, well, this did not work, and why, and what did I do to change that? Okay, another fun question. Explain a time when your supervisor asked you to do something you didn't agree with. How did you handle it? Okay, well, there are a lot of ways to answer that sort of a question. And I always like to go back to anytime a teacher or an administrator or someone comes up and asks me to do something, I like to answer with, I take a step back and I think, what's best for kids? Why are they asking? What exactly do they want me to do? What's the best way that I can do this and remain true to what I teach, but also answer their need? And so if, in this example, when's the time that someone asked you to do something you did not agree with? Okay, well, I have an example of one time when an administrator asked me to teach a writing lesson in music, and to teach a lesson where they had to write a paragraph or come up with a story or whatever. And, there was a building initiative on learning and literacy, and I think that is great. The problem is that we have so little time in music to hit this huge curriculum. And so how can I, in an authentic way, do what my principal asks, but also serve my students and serve the content? And I think, there are a couple ways that you could do that. If a principal asks you to integrate more writing, you could, create stories that are new endings to songs that you've already taught, and then have students sing those endings. You could write a story that explains a concept in music. You could, a really great way would be to record something that you've already done and ask students to evaluate themselves and write a quick paragraph about what they liked, what they didn't like, what they thought they could do better. All of those are ways that you could integrate writing, even though my principal is you got to have a writing lesson. And here are some examples, and only gave me core content like homeroom class examples. Like, I'm not going to do that. But what are some, to just show like that answer shows like I'm a team player, even though it wasn't exactly what I liked. I found a way to make it work while focusing on what was best for students. Another example is like, what if, a teacher comes up and says, hey, could you do this? Well, I do want to support math in the building. I think math is so important. But I'm not going to teach the times table song because that feels sort of authentic. And it's also the lowest level of Bloom's taxonomy for critical thinking. So I think maybe a better way to do that would be to talk about how, we talk about divisions and fractions in different ways in the music class, and we talk about that all the time. We talk about groupings. If it's a literacy thing, we talk about syllabification. We talk about how words work. We talk about, all these, there are ways to answer that question that show like you care about your content, you care about your relationship with other people in the building, but you want the focus to be on kids. That's a great thing to think about as you're doing interview questions. The answer should always be the focus is on kids and what's best for kids and what's best for their learning. It should never be about like, well, here's what I think is correct, but more like, I think this is the right way to do it, but I think it's that because what is best for kids? Kids learn best this, whatever. It's always the focus is always what's best for students. Okay, I could go through a couple more, but let me think. There's one more that I wanted to hit. Oh yeah, or like tell me about a time where you disagreed with someone else in the building. How did you handle it? Okay, well that you could easily go to that like quick thought of like, oh my gosh, I'm going to tell you about this one time the third grade teacher made me so mad, but this is not a rant session. This is an interview. And so I think the more that you can focus on talking about like how do you make connections in the building, how do you build community, the more that you can say things like what's best for students or school community or, connecting with parents, all of those are really great things that principals want to hear. They want to hear you say like, I care about what's best for students. I'm trying to, build a program over time. And, they want to hear those legacy things. And they also want to know that you can answer the content questions as well. Okay, let me see if I can go through, because the other thing I do is after an interview, I just write down what did they ask and what did they ask and then like what was your answer? Just so, because like later you don't remember. So as soon as I leave an interview, I just like try and write down some of those questions. Okay, you could talk about including all learners, differentiating. That's really easy in a music classroom because like if you teach where like all students play all parts. Well, then you can eventually work down to where like a couple of kids play the triangle and a couple of kids play the woodblock, but everybody's playing, everyone's doing it, everyone can try it. They might ask a question about scaffolding, or you should have an example of scaffolding. They might talk about how do you integrate with other disciplines? Oh, I love talking about that one. We talk about problem solving, we talk about literacy integration, we talk about math integration. There are lots of ways to do that. Let's see. Oh, there was another great question here. Yeah, if an observer watching your classroom, what would they see? Can you give us a sample lesson? Those are things they might ask. Special student learners. What's the biggest struggle you've ever had and what did you learn from it? What led you to be an educator? Let's see. What's another one that I thought was a good question? Oh, they might ask about contact with parents. They might ask you about concerts, maybe. They might ask you about technology, too. Yeah, and whenever I get asked about technology, I say, technology is great for music classrooms because it is so much easier and simpler to bring examples to students that way through technology, because it takes a lot of work to take them to the symphony, but in any class for 2 minutes, I can show them a clip of our symphony or an example of a musician playing or, and I want them to have those examples where we do go to the symphony. I want them to have those experiences, but I also know that if it's just this one grade that needs this example in this one middle of the day, I can use and find a really quality example. There's so many amazing examples that are free online that I can bring into the classroom to share with students. That's amazing. For example, I connected with the Marine Band a couple years ago, blah, 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 and had an interview. There are lots of ways to include some of those questions, but, I use technology to enhance books, to add soundtracks. I do it to put big images on the board so all kids can see better and see examples. And in the moment, we document cameras and blah blah blah. There are lots of ways to answer that. More than just like, I use a computer. All students bring iPads. That does not necessarily have to be the answer you go with. It can be it can be more like, here are ways that we integrate our core content and use technology to make that happen. Yeah, the more I look through all these questions, there are a lot of examples, and I hope that maybe people will. I'll put a call for some questions on the Facebook group, Every Moment Matters Music Education Community, and I'll see if I can post some of my sample questions that I've experienced, and also I hope people will post theirs, so you can sort of see like maybe what you might be walking into if you go into an interview. But I think in general, the more you can think about those questions ahead of time and have real life examples from your classroom. If you only have done student teaching, pull examples from that. Write them down so that you can rehearse and think about those examples in your head before you walk into an interview. But have some examples that are concrete examples, and always think, how can I focus my answer so that it centers kids, that it talks about like building community, and that it thinks about it, that shows potential employers that I am a thoughtful educator who cares about the needs of students. Like, how can I answer questions in that way? Those are always great guiding ideas. Okay, so I spent like a half an hour talking through some possible answers now, but I'm going to put some of those questions out on the Facebook group so you all can put your possible answers in there. I hope this has been sort of helpful to give you ideas of what you might come up against if you're in an interview. But again, like I said at the beginning, every interviewer is different. Every situation is different. And you may give a really amazing, wonderful answer, and the interviewer may hate it because they, who knows, like already have a candidate in mind, or they had a terrible experience with their elementary music teacher. Or what's really funny is when you start saying things and they're like, but when I was growing up, we just rolled the piano into the third grade room and that was music class. I'm like, cool, but like interviews are great because you can teach, you can talk about teaching students, you can teach the interviewers at the same time if you are able to do that, but you also can learn from them. Are you going to be a good fit? Are they going to be a good advocate for me? I mean, there's a lot you can learn in those interviews. Okay, this gave you some questions on how you might answer. I'm going to post that question in the Facebook group tonight so that people can start posting their sample questions, but check that out so you can see sort of what people have been asked or what they might ask. So you can sort of get some ideas of what you might come up in an interview. Okay, I'll be back again next week. Thanks so much for coming along with me, everyone. Have a great night. Bye, everyone.